Welcome to Module 2, Asynchronous Discussion Tools. In this module, we're specifically going to talk about how to use asynchronous environments to support communication and collaboration with your students. And we're going to dive into 5 different examples of how to use an asynchronous discussion board in K-12 virtual education. Now, asynchronous discussions clearly encourage collaboration. You all are participating in asynchronous discussions, hopefully, in this course. And it allows you to interact and collaborate and brainstorm on ideas, talk through questions, debate issues in a group setting. And that can be really valuable in your virtual class, particularly if you are teaching fully online and need to replicate that interaction with students that you would normally have in a physical discussion. Asynchronous discussions also help you promote deeper reflection in your students. It gives them a moment, not just in the moment to answer a question, but to think about a question or formulate an opinion and then justify that opinion or thought. It allows for you to help students apply concepts and work with one another to think about how well they applied that particular concept or where they may have missed something. And it can help you help your students answer questions en masse. We'll talk about this one as one of our examples, but it's a great place for you to communicate a question or a concern that a student may have to all students, especially beneficial for those students that may not speak up and ask that particular question, but may be wondering the answer. It can allow for personalization. So asynchronous discussions can give you an opportunity for students to think very personally, or as we mentioned before, reflect on how a concept or an activity or a skill or a question or a challenge that you're presenting to them may impact their own lives or the world around them. So let's give you 5 examples of different kinds of ways to use an asynchronous discussion. Now, before we get into these examples, please know that there are all sorts of tools out there that you can support asynchronous discussions with, and we'll talk about those after these examples. So don't worry about the technology at the moment, just think from a lesson and concept perspective. So our first example is the get to know you discussion. We've all done this. It's the introduce yourself at the beginning of a course discussion. Now, in virtual teaching, this can be really important because students may not know each other and they may not feel comfortable interacting in an environment, or they may not even feel engaged if they don't feel like they have a sense of who else is in the class. They may either feel like they need to prove themselves, or they may feel like they're just going to stay quiet because they don't feel as though they fit into the class because they don't know who's in the class. So setting up a get-to-know-you discussion is a great tool. The one thing, though, I encourage you to do when you're setting up a get-to-know-you discussion is to be very creative about what kinds of questions you ask students to answer in that get-to-know-you. Rather than just who are you, what's your background, although that can be very important, you know, what city do you live in, or where did you grow up, or what's your ethnicity? Those kinds of questions can be good questions. But ask some interesting things like, what was your favorite summer vacation? Or things that allow students to be personal in their answers, because that personal connection, although still safe personal, but personal connection can help them then bond with other students in the course and find people that they can collaborate throughout the duration of the course. There are also really fun things to play off of as an instructor, especially if somebody writes, my favorite summer vacation was when I went to Disneyland, and you happen to go to Disneyland as an instructor, 10 times a year because you love it, and Space Mountain is your favorite ride. Well, that would be a great thing to then connect with students, and then they're going to remember you and feel a little more connected with you in that online space than they may not have otherwise. So that's an easy one. The get to know you is an easy one. We probably all do this anyway in our classes. It's a good one to do with asynchronous discussions. A spin-off of the get to know you discussion is what we call the Watercooler Discussion. This is definitely a US-based phrase, but in the US, the water cooler is often where in offices people will then go chit-chat or talk about things going on in the work environment. Well, that chit-chat often isn't related to the particular work that people are doing, or it may just be about a TV show that everybody watched the night before. Well, that water cooler discussion needs to happen in a classroom too. In the physical space, it's those conversations that students have when they come into the class or when they leave the class, or the ones that you have to go shh to get them to quiet down in order to participate in the activity. Well, it's great to have those though. Students bond, they connect, they feel more safe, they personalize, and they socialize with those. So setting up discussion environments, asynchronous discussion environments, where those discussions can happen becomes really important. And you can do things like say, I won't ever check it, and be serious about that, so students can feel like they can have any conversation they want. Or if you see students saying things in other discussions that are really meant for the water cooler, you can move it to the water cooler and get students to feel like, oh no, okay, that's where we go have those conversations. And you can allow students, or maybe you can even encourage students to talk about crazy stuff. Perhaps you are a snowboarder and your students like to snowboard. Well, maybe you went snowboarding and you want to post a picture of you snowboarding that weekend before, or the cool snow that was at the local ski area. Well, that kind of thing can help get your students connected, and that's the kind of thing that would fit in a water cooler space. It also helps you keep your other discussions tight to the particular topics that you've set forth. Third one, this is my favorite one, and I do this a lot in my classes. I love the role play discussion. This is where you divide up your students into various groups. And in those groups, each group has a particular role that they would play in some sort of issue or game. The one that I've used in the past is a town hall, and there's an environmental issue. I've seen this in a science class and in a history class done. So there's an environmental issue that's very important to the local community, and you want to have different roles approach that issue. So one group are the engineers, and they're analyzing that from an engineering perspective. Another group are politicians, and they care about getting votes and being able to make sure that the people's needs are being met in the community. A third group might be activists that are really concerned about animals in that region that could be affected. A fourth group could be business folks that want to design housing in a particular environment, and there's environmental issues related to that. Anyway, you get the sense that you could have these groups, and each student would play a particular role, or each group of students would play a particular role in this role play. Well, in the discussions, you can create separate discussion places where each of those groups of students are discussing their role. And then you can have them come together in a joint discussion and debate the issue from each of their perspectives. They have to play that role. I've seen something similar done with English writers. So in an English class, famous English authors, or famous authors in general, I should say, in an English class, having students play the roles of those authors, and they come together and they debate a piece of work. So great way to get students to be in role, in character, to think about those ideas, to distribute an experience across students, and to use asynchronous discussions in kind of an engaging and game-oriented way. The fourth kind of discussion is the problem-solving discussion. In this case, students would come together and solve some sort of problem or issue or task at hand. I strongly suggest if you're going to do problem-solving discussions, you create problems for students that are open-ended and then have multiple approaches. And encourage students to debate what would be the best approach to solving that problem. Discussions are not a great place for whether if there's only one answer or maybe three answers. Not the best place for that, because then once those one or two or three answers are posted, students don't have anything else to say. But give them a problem, a meaty problem that they have to tackle. They have to approach that problem and explain their approach and even justify their approach, and then the rest of your students can debate that approach. And the last kind of example of using an asynchronous discussion is the review session discussion. So this can be a great place if students, virtual students particularly, are preparing for an exam. Well, if they're preparing for an exam the night before, which is probably when they're preparing for that exam, they may have questions, and you can offer to be online for 2 hours or an hour, or maybe you tell them you can prepare for 2 days before, post your questions in the discussions and help each other out. And it could be a great way virtually where they can help answer each other's questions, they can point each other to resources, and you can then be clear about your time of participation and also help answer those questions. It's a great way to cover that review session. We're going to talk about that in the synchronous session as well, but this gives you a sense of this help each other, answer each other's questions, and do it in a way that's impactful for an event or an exam that's coming up. Now, a few quick tips for managing discussions. As you're thinking about doing them, make sure, as I mentioned before, when you ask a question or you prompt a question, that there's more than one answer. In fact, you want to make sure that there's more than 10 answers usually. You want students to have to come up with and feel comfortable with having their own individual answers. If there's a right and a wrong, it's no longer really a very engaging discussion. Also think about making sure that those discussions align to particular outcomes and are assessed. That's important because you want to make sure that the discussion is actually important. So there's a game, and I think it's a worldwide game. It's a physical game that I've played since I was a kid. It's called Jenga. It's basically you stack blocks on top of each other, or sticks. It was originally made with sticks. And then you try to pull a stick out, but leave the structure standing. I always say if you've got a discussion that you've established, and let's say each one of those discussions or everything you're doing in your course is an individual stick, and you pull that discussion out and nothing falls, you probably didn't need to have that discussion. That means students would have learned the same with or without that discussion. I know that sounds a little bit silly, and that of course we don't want to do that, but I still see teachers every day do this really often. They love to just throw questions out there and have students discuss because they think discussing is really important, which it is. But they don't think about, is that actually aligned to a particular outcome, and am I actually assessing the value of that particular discussion? Also important is not repeating discussions. So if you've had it in class, let's say you're teaching a blended environment. If you've had it in class, don't have the same discussion in a discussion forum as well. Or if you've had it in the discussion forum, don't necessarily rehash it completely in a synchronous setting. Make sure that if you do bring it up, you highlight some of the really good points or answer some of the questions, but that you don't just redo that question all over again. And then finally, you want to make sure you count only when the number is actually important. So I see teachers all the time implement discussion boards, asynchronous discussion forums, and tell students, you have to post 4 times and you have to respond to 7 students. Well, what that's teaching students is, in my opinion, okay, you have to post 4 times and it's the volume of your posts that's important, and then you have to respond, so it's the volume of the responses. It's not necessarily what's being said in those posts and those responses. Now, if you count and you assess what's being said, that's a different story. So you can count, and oftentimes when you're working with students that have never discussed in an asynchronous discussion, you do need to set some standards. You need to post this many times, you need to make sure you respond. That's important. But then assess the quality of the post, or the way they're interacting, or the quality of the feedback that they're giving other students, in addition to the counting. Or else it becomes just another worksheet type activity for students and not something really valuable to their learning. And then last, stick to your practice. And I say this because it's important that if you are going to have asynchronous discussions, that you're very clear with students when and how you'll respond, and you stick to it. So if you set criteria for yourself, so you don't feel like you're in discussions 24/7, because none of us want to do that, you actually set parameters for yourself and then you stick to them. So students know you'll go check the discussions on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 5 and 6. And that you'll respond in aggregate to students, but they shouldn't expect an individual response. Or if they should expect an individual response, depending on how you've structured your course. But be clear with students up front, be super explicit, and then stick to your practice. Now, as I promised, here's a quick list of some of the providers and tools of asynchronous discussions for you to go ahead and investigate. One of the most common ones used is Google Groups. You can use this, and it embeds in all of the other Google tools, especially the Google Tools for Education. And so this can be a really easy way to get it started. However, it is in the cloud, and students do have accounts for this, so you have to be careful with that, depending on how you may want to choose to use this. You can also use tools like Piazza and VoiceThread. Both of them, especially Piazza, have free offerings and then for cost offerings if you want to do some more advanced stuff. But those are great standalone tools. VoiceThread actually incorporates voice or audio discussion prompts and responses, not just text. And then the learning management systems and VLEs of the world, they definitely incorporate asynchronous discussions. All of them will have some sort of tool that you can capitalize and use. You can even use blogs or social networking tools as a way to support asynchronous discussions. If you think about it, Facebook is a gigantic asynchronous discussion. So depending on how you may want to use those, you can use those as well. So let's reflect on what we've just discussed. In a hypothetical situation, as we usually discuss, you are looking to use an asynchronous discussion to help your students with a concept that they're struggling with. So you know, in past experiences teaching this concept, I think of this, I worked with a math teacher in this situation where there was a particular derivation of a formula that students had so much difficulty with. And so she wanted to use asynchronous discussions as a way to debate all of the different ways that you could derive that formula and why they were right or they were wrong. And generally it was why they were wrong, since there was really one way to derive that formula. But in this case, it gave students an example and an opportunity to talk through what they may be struggling with and why. And she found that not only did it help them understand that concept better, but it helped them do that same kind of activity better in future situations, because now they knew how to more critically analyze what they were trying to do, or they understood sort of the pitfall that they regularly fell in. So think about in your own class, what would be one, or in your own teaching, what would be one concept that students have a really hard time grasping with at the outset, and how might you use asynchronous discussions to support that?